This is a story about how a home is built not with timber and nails, but with the quiet courage to offer sanctuary and the even quieter courage to accept it. It is a promise that love is not always a roaring fire, but sometimes it is the steady, unwavering lamplight in a window, a beacon for a soul lost in the dark, a vow that says simply, "You are safe here." Caleb Thorne was a man acquainted with the anatomy of silence. As the sole coffin-maker for the town of Redemption, his life was a study in quiet, orderly conclusions. The scent of cedar shavings was his only constant companion. The rhythmic rasp of his plane, the soft thud of the hammer, these were the sounds that scored his days. He lived in the rooms above his workshop, a space as Spartan as his existence. One chair was tucked neatly under a small table. One plate, one cup, one fork sat drying by the wash basin. Loneliness was not a guest in his home. It was the foundation upon which it was built, a familiar weight he carried with the same stoic competence as a plank of fresh pine. He had long ago made his peace with it. But some evenings after the tools were cleaned and oiled, he would stand by the window, watching the last light bleed from the sky, and the silence would deepen, pressing in on him with the weight of all the things his life was not. On such an evening, a stifling summer day that had baked the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder, the orderly lines of his life were fractured. He had been on his way back from the mercantile when the commotion started. A loose knot of onlookers, the smirks and jeers of men outside the saloon. At the center of their cruel attention was a woman, heavily pregnant, her face a pale mask of desperation. She stumbled, her hand pressed to her belly, her balance lost in the unforgiving ruts of the road. She fell not with a cry, but with a soft, final sigh, like a sail giving up its wind. And then, the most terrible sound of all, a ripple of coarse laughter. The town looked on, a study in casual cruelty. Caleb felt something cold and hard clench in his gut. Before the dust of her fall had even settled, he was moving. He pushed through the gawking crowd, his face a thundercloud of quiet fury. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her like a shield. Her eyes fluttered open, dark with shame and fear. He said nothing. He simply slid one arm beneath her shoulders, and the other under her knees, and lifted. She was lighter than he expected, yet she felt like the weightiest thing he had ever held. He turned his back on the suddenly silent town and carried her toward the scent of cedar and solitude, toward the only sanctuary he had to offer. The sign above his door read C. Thorne, fine woodworking and final arrangements. Today, it would be a place of beginnings. Amelia woke to the gentle, clean scent of cedarwood. A soft breeze stirred the air from a single open window, carrying with it the distant, rhythmic sound of a wood plane. She was lying in a narrow but comfortable bed, a simple mended quilt drawn up to her chin. The room was sparse, almost monastic in its simplicity. A single chair, a small table, a washstand with one basin. There was a profound and settled solitude to the space, and in it she felt the first flicker of safety she had known in months. Panic, a cold and familiar companion, tried to surface as she remembered the fall, the jeering faces, the stranger's arms. She pushed herself up, her hand flying to her belly, where a reassuring flutter answered her fear. The door opened with a soft creak. The man from the street stood there, filling the frame. He was tall and broad, his sleeves rolled to his forearms, revealing strong, capable hands dusted with fine sawdust. He held a steaming bowl in his hands. He stopped just inside the door, a respectful distance away, his presence not imposing, but watchful. His eyes were a calm, steady gray, and they held no judgment, only a quiet concern. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a low, even rumble. "The doctor is out of town. I brought you here, to my home." He gestured with his head to the bowl. "Broth, you should eat." He set the bowl on the small table, then retreated back toward the door, giving her space. "You can have the bed," he continued, his gaze fixed on a point on the far wall, as if speaking the words to the room itself. "I'll sleep in the workshop, downstairs. You will be undisturbed." It was a boundary, drawn immediately and with unwavering honor. He was offering her sanctuary, not demanding a debt. She was a survivor, and she knew the difference. Survival had taught her to read the subtle currents in a man's voice, the intent in his posture. This man, for all his stoic exterior, was offering a kindness so plain and unadorned it felt like a miracle. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. The broth was warm, and it settled her. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the deep-etched lines of a loneliness that mirrored her own. "I am Amelia," she said, her voice a little stronger. "Caleb," he replied, giving a short, almost formal nod. And with that simple exchange of names, a fragile truce was struck. She was Amelia. He was Caleb. And this quiet room, smelling of cedar and solitude, was, for now, their shared world. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Caleb would rise before dawn, his movements in the workshop below a muffled, comforting percussion to Amelia's waking. He would leave a tray outside her door, a bowl of porridge, a piece of bread, a mug of weak tea, and then retreat, leaving her to her privacy. His consideration was a constant, gentle presence. He was a man who spoke in deeds, not words. The first time she was strong enough to venture down the stairs, she found him at his workbench, his back to her, planing a long plank of pale pine. The shavings curled at his feet like fallen leaves. The workshop was a cathedral of quiet craftsmanship. Finished and unfinished coffins lined one wall, but they did not frighten her. She saw them for what they were, the work of a man who took care, even in endings. There was an honor in it, a final act of service that resonated with her own weary soul. Caleb turned, sensing her presence. He did not seem surprised, merely paused his work, his hands resting on the plane. She saw a tear in the shoulder of his worn work shirt, a clumsy, thick-stitched repair pulling the fabric into a pucker. Without thinking, she took a step forward. "May I?" she asked, her voice soft in the cavernous room. She gestured toward the shirt. He looked down at the offending seam, and back at her, a flicker of something surprise, confusion in his gray eyes. For a moment, he simply stood there, a large, still man in a room full of finished things. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he stripped off the shirt, leaving him in his thin undershirt. He handed it to her, the fabric still warm from his body. "I lack the skill for it," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. She took the shirt and sat on a nearby stool, pulling a small sewing kit from the pocket of her dress. He did not retreat. He remained watching her. She worked with a practiced efficiency, her small, neat stitches a stark contrast to his own clumsy ones. She felt his gaze on her hands, a silent, intense scrutiny. She was not just mending a shirt. She was stitching together the first threads of a fragile trust, right here in this quiet workshop of endings. When she finished, she held it up. The seam was a perfect, almost invisible line. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. He reached for the shirt, and as she passed it to him, his fingers brushed against hers. A spark of warmth, unexpected and potent, arced between them. They both drew back slightly, the charged silence humming in the space between them. A guardedness was beginning to shift, ever so slightly, into a quiet, tentative longing. Amelia began to reclaim her strength, and with it, her agency. The rooms above the workshop were Caleb's home, but they were a shell, a place where a man slept and ate, but did not truly live. A fine layer of dust coated the surfaces he didn't use. The single window was streaked with grime, and his few books sat in a disordered pile in a corner. She began, slowly, to bring a quiet order to the space. It was not a repayment of a debt, but an act of shared existence. She was not a guest here, or a patient. She was a partner in this strange, silent domesticity. She would wash both her bowl and his, setting them side by side to dry. She cleaned the window, and the afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She stacked his books neatly, running her hand over the worn leather spines. One afternoon, Caleb came up from the workshop, his hands stained dark with wood varnish, and stopped in the doorway. He saw the two mugs, his and the one he had given her, sitting together on the clean table. He saw the sunlight glinting off the clear window pane. His gaze fell on her as she sat in the chair by the light, one of his books open in her lap. She wasn't reading, he realized. She was just looking at the words, her brow furrowed in concentration. Amelia looked up, a faint flush rising in her cheeks as she was caught. "The letters are a puzzle to me sometimes," she admitted, her voice quiet with the shame she had long carried. Caleb looked at her fierce pride and her quiet vulnerability, and a protective tenderness swelled in his chest. He washed his hands at the basin, scrubbing away the stain of his work, and then pulled the single chair from the table to sit near her, leaving a respectful space between them. "That one is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer," he said, his voice a soft rumble. "If you like, I could read it to you." Her eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and a deep, yearning gratitude. "I would like that," she whispered. So began their evening ritual. After his supper tray was cleared, he would sit in the chair, she on the edge of the bed, and he would read. His voice, steady and deep, filled the quiet room, painting pictures of riverboats and adventures far from their small, dusty world. It was a comfort, a balm to her weary soul. He would ask, before shifting closer to better catch the lamplight. He would pause to see if she was tired. His every gesture was a question, his every action an offering that honored her autonomy. In these quiet, shared moments, the walls of their solitude began to crumble, not with a crash, but with the slow, steady erosion of gentle, consistent care. The first chill of autumn began to creep into the night air, a reminder that the seasons were turning, that time was passing. Amelia's pregnancy was advancing, her body growing heavier, her movements slower. The baby, once a gentle flutter, was now a constant, rolling presence beneath her ribs. With this new stage came a new and terrifying vulnerability. One night, a sharp, searing pain shot through her back, stealing her breath. A choked cry escaped her lips. Caleb was on his pallet on the workshop floor below, but he heard it. He was upstairs in an instant, his hair disheveled, his eyes wide with a raw, unguarded alarm. "Amelia? What is it?" He saw her face, pale and tight with pain, and a fear more potent than any he had ever known seized him. It was a primal protective terror for her, for the child, for this small, fragile family he had accidentally started to build. He crossed the room and knelt by her bed. "Breathe," he said, his voice rough with his own panic. He reached for her hand, his own large, calloused one enveloping hers. His touch was not gentle. It was a desperate, grounding anchor in a storm. She clung to him, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged gasps as another wave of pain crested. He held on, murmuring quiet, nonsensical words of comfort, his presence a solid, unwavering shield against the fear and the pain. After a long, terrifying few minutes, the cramping subsided, leaving her weak and trembling, a fine sheen of sweat on her brow. It was not labor, not yet, but it was a stark, brutal preview of what was to come. The crisis had passed, but the charged energy of it remained, a live wire humming in the quiet room. It had stripped away their careful, polite distance, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Caleb did not immediately retreat. He stayed kneeling by her bed, his hand still holding hers, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist in a slow, soothing rhythm. That night, he did not go back down to the workshop. The thought of being separated from her by a floor, of not hearing her if she called, was unbearable. But he would not presume. He waited. Amelia lay in the darkness, the lingering ache in her back a dull echo of the earlier pain. But a greater ache was the thought of being alone. The terror she had felt was eased not just by the passing of the pain, but by the solid, steady presence of the man kneeling beside her. She needed him close. She was the survivor, the one who set the boundaries. The choice had to be hers. Caleb? She whispered into the darkness. Stay. It was not a plea. It was an invitation, a statement of need. The floor up here is warmer, she added, a practical excuse for an emotional truth. So you can hear me. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. Only if you are sure, he said, their now familiar refrain of consent. I'm sure, she answered, her voice firm. He rose and, without a word, fetched his pallet and blanket from the workshop. He laid it on the floor near the foot of her bed, not too close, but near enough that she could see his silhouette in the moonlight, near enough to hear him breathe. He was her guardian, her protector, and now, by her own explicit choice, he was here, sharing her space, sharing her watch, a silent partner in the long, dark night. As Amelia's time grew nearer, their supplies dwindled. A trip into redemption was a necessity they had been postponing, but it could be put off no longer. The thought of facing the town's judgmental eyes made Amelia's stomach clench, but they needed flour and salt and flannel for the baby. The walk into the center of town was an ordeal. Caleb walked beside her, his stride shortened to match her slower, more deliberate pace. He was a solid wall of quiet strength at her side, his presence a buffer against the curious stares and whispered comments that followed them like a cloud of flies. He felt the eyes on them, particularly on Amelia, and a cold, protective anger simmered in his chest. He wanted to gather her up and carry her away from their petty, cruel gazes, but he knew that her dignity required her to walk on her own 2 feet. So he stayed close, a silent, menacing promise to any who dared to speak their judgment aloud. It was in front of the mercantile that their quiet world was shattered. A man stepped out onto the boardwalk, blocking their path. He was well-dressed, with a handsome but weak face that was contorted into a sneer of righteous indignation. "Amelia," he said, his voice carrying an owner's displeasure. "So this is where you've been hiding, living in sin with the town's ghoul." Amelia froze, her hand flying instinctively to her belly. "Jonas," she breathed, her face losing what little color it had. Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between them. His movement was not aggressive, but it was absolute, a silent, immovable declaration. Jonas's eyes flickered to Caleb, dismissing him with a contemptuous glance. "I've come to take you home," he said to Amelia, as if Caleb wasn't there. "The family is prepared to overlook your lapse. The child will be raised properly, as a Barrett." "He will be raised by me," Amelia said, her voice trembling but firm. She found her strength, anchoring herself to the steady presence of Caleb's back. "This is a family matter," Jonas spat, his frustration growing. "It has nothing to do with him. He was a predator, used to his authority being respected, his will being done. He could not comprehend this quiet, stubborn resistance." "She is under my protection," Caleb said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "And this is my home. You are not welcome here." "Protection?" Jonas laughed, a short, ugly sound. "She needs a husband, a respectable name, not the charity of a man who profits from death. You have no claim here." The social stakes had been laid bare. The entitled suitor, the coercive family, had arrived to test the fragile bond they had built in the quiet of the workshop. The town was watching, and for the first time, Caleb and Amelia stood together, not as a caregiver and his charge, but as a united front against the world. The walk back to the workshop was a blur of taut silence. Jonas's threats, his casual cruelty, his assumption of ownership, It all echoed in the space between them. The sanctuary Caleb had built felt fragile now, its walls breached by the outside world. Back in the quiet of the rooms above the workshop, the confrontation played over and over in Amelia's mind. Caleb stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders a rigid line of tension. The threat was no longer a vague shadow from her past. It had a name and a face, and it would be back. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that Caleb had a right to know exactly what kind of battle he had just enlisted in. The baby's father. His name was Thomas, she began, her voice quiet but steady in the still room. Caleb turned from the window, his full attention on her. He didn't speak, but his gray eyes were an invitation to continue. She told him everything. She spoke of Thomas Barrett, a kind, gentle man trapped under the thumb of a domineering family. Their love had been a secret, a stolen thing. He had promised to marry her, to defy them, but a fever had taken him before he could. When she had gone to his family, to his older brother Jonas, to tell them she was carrying Thomas's child, they had shown their true colors. They didn't see a grandchild, a niece, or nephew. They saw a complication, a threat to their pristine family name, and then a sudden realization, an heir. They offered to pay me for the child, she said, the memory a fresh, bitter wound. They wanted to take my baby and raise it as a Barrett, and send me away with nothing. They wanted to erase me from his life. I refused, so I ran. When her story was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Caleb's face was carved from stone, a muscle working in his jaw. He sees you as a vessel, he said, his voice a low, angry growl, and the child as a piece of property. Yes, she whispered. She had laid her vulnerability bare. Now she looked at him, at this quiet, solitary man who dealt in endings. And you, Caleb? Why are you here? Why are you alone? He was silent for a long moment, his gaze turned inward to a past he kept locked away. He sat down in the chair opposite her, the lamplight casting deep shadows across his face. He told her he had been a doctor once, a surgeon in the war. He spoke not of battles, but of the endless tide of wounded and dying men. He spoke of the futility of it, of patching men up only to send them back into the meat grinder. I lost the thread of it, he said, his voice rough with an old, settled grief. Healing. I couldn't see the point of it anymore. Too many endings, not enough beginnings. He had come to redemption to escape it all. He chose to make coffins because it was honest. It was a final, necessary service. There was no pretense of a cure, no false hope. Just a quiet, dignified container for a life that was over. I understood endings, he finished, his voice barely a whisper. I had forgotten what a beginning felt like. He looked at her then, his guard completely down, and she saw the profound, aching loneliness he kept hidden beneath his stoic shell. His confession opened the last door between them. She understood the quiet, protective walls he had built around himself. And he understood the fierce, desperate fight she was waging for her child, for her future. They were two survivors, two lonely souls who had found in each other a reason to fight for a new beginning. Jonas returned 2 days later, just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the yard. This time, he brought the town marshal, a man whose loyalty was known to be as flexible as the highest bid. They stood before the workshop, an official, sanctioned threat. Caleb met them on the porch. He was not armed. His strength was not in weapons, but in his unwavering stillness. Amelia stood in the open doorway behind him, her hand resting on the frame, her presence a silent declaration. This was her battle, too. She would not hide. Thorne, the marshal said, his voice full of a blustering, borrowed authority. Mr. Barrett has filed a legal petition. He claims, as the child's next of kin, guardianship of the infant upon its birth. He has concerns for the mother's fitness and the suitability of her current arrangements. This was it. the decisive, non-violent confrontation that would determine their future. It would not be won with fists, but with truth. It was Amelia who stepped forward, moving from the doorway to stand beside Caleb. She faced Jonas directly, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her voice was clear and strong. "My fitness?" she asked, her voice ringing with a cold, righteous anger. "Is it my fitness you question, Jonas, or my obedience? You do not care for this child. You care for the inheritance he represents." She then turned her gaze to the marshal, her expression steady and sane. "This man," she said, her voice dropping to a tone of quiet, powerful conviction, and she laid her hand on Caleb's arm, feeling the solid, living strength of him beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. "This man took me in when I was a stranger collapsing in your street, when your good citizens laughed. He has given me shelter and food and his unwavering protection. He has treated me with a respect and an honor that the Barrett family knows nothing about." She looked from the marshal back to Jonas, her final declaration aimed at him like an arrow. "I have made my choice. This is my home. This is my family." She squeezed Caleb's arm, a wordless signal of their unbreakable bond. He looked down at her hand, then back up to meet her eyes. In that single shared glance, a lifetime of vows was exchanged. He was her partner. She was his. The marshal, a man who understood the letter of the law, if not its spirit, shifted uncomfortably. He saw a woman of sound mind, making a clear and unequivocal choice. He saw a man standing beside her, who would clearly not be moved by anything short of a cannon. And he saw no crime being committed. "Well," the marshal cleared his throat, avoiding Jonas's furious gaze, "if the lady ain't being held against her will, then there's nothing for me to do here. This is a civil matter for a circuit judge to decide, and he ain't due for months." He tipped his hat awkwardly and retreated, leaving Jonas standing alone, his legal weapons suddenly useless. He was defeated, not by Caleb's strength, but by Amelia's voice. Her agency was her shield and her sword. He cast one last look at them, a look of pure, impotent hatred, and then turned and stormed away. The battle was over. They had chosen each other, and in doing so, had chosen their future. The moment Jonas's retreating back disappeared down the street, the rigid control Amelia had maintained dissolved. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and a sharp, undeniable pain seized her from behind. It was not like the false alarm before. This was a deep, powerful clenching that stole her breath. She gave a small, sharp cry, and her legs buckled. Caleb caught her, his arms wrapping around her, easily taking her weight. The confrontation had taken its toll. The stress had pushed her body into labor. "It's time," she gasped, her face pale. The falling action was not a quiet respite, but an immediate, urgent crisis. He swept her up into his arms and carried her inside, up the stairs to the quiet room that had become her sanctuary. He laid her gently on the bed, his movements swift and competent. The fear was back in his eyes, but this time it was tempered with a fierce resolve. "I've sent for the midwife," he said, his voice a low, calming rumble as he smoothed the hair back from her damp forehead. "She'll be here soon. You are not alone." The midwife, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense woman named Martha, arrived in a flurry of clean linens and brisk commands. She took one look at Caleb's anxious, hovering presence and pointed a stern finger toward the door. "Out, you can be useful and boil water, lots of it." For hours, he paced the small space between the workshop and the house. He boiled water until the entire workshop was filled with steam. He listened to the sounds from upstairs, Amelia's low moans, her sharp cries of pain, the midwife's steady, encouraging voice. He felt a profound and agonizing helplessness, a feeling he hadn't experienced with such intensity since the war. He could set a bone, stitch a wound, but this miracle, this raw, elemental act of creation, was entirely beyond him. He could only stand watch. And then, after an eternity, a new sound cut through the night, the thin, wavering cry of a newborn, a cry of life. He sagged against the doorframe, his legs weak with relief, a sound that was half laugh, half sob escaping his own lips. An hour later, Martha emerged, looking tired but satisfied. "You have a son," she said, a rare smile touching her lips. "And a strong woman in there. You can go in now." The room was quiet, dimly lit by a single lamp. The air was thick with the scent of life, of birth. Amelia was pale, exhausted, but her eyes were luminous. In her arms, wrapped in a flannel cloth, was a tiny, perfect infant. Caleb approached the bed slowly, as if it were a holy shrine. He looked at the baby, at his tiny, wrinkled face and the thatch of dark hair. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees washed over him. He sank to the edge of the bed. Amelia's hand, so small and fragile, found his. Her fingers were cold. He lifted her hand and began to chafe it between his own, his familiar gesture of care and comfort. He saw a smudge of ink or dirt from the street on her palm. Without a word, he took the warm, damp cloth from the wash basin and gently, tenderly, began to wash her hands. He cleaned each finger, his touch reverent. It was an act of aftercare, a quiet, intimate ritual. He was washing away the grime of the world, the residue of the battle she had just won. This was his service. This was his love. In the quiet, peaceful days that followed the birth, the small rooms above the workshop were transformed. They were no longer a sanctuary from the world, but a world unto themselves, filled with the soft sounds and gentle rhythms of a new life. The sharp, clean scent of cedar from the workshop below now mingled with the sweet, milky scent of a baby. Caleb found his old solitary routines completely erased, replaced by a new choreography centered around Amelia and their son. He would watch, mesmerized, as she nursed the baby, a fierce, protective tenderness swelling in his chest until he thought it might burst. He had spent years building coffins, final homes for the dead. Now his home was filled with a vibrant, demanding new life, and he had never known such profound contentment. On the third day, Amelia was sitting up in bed, the baby sleeping peacefully in the crook of her arm. Caleb came in from the workshop, his hands gray with sawdust. He was holding something. It was a cradle, newly made, carved from the same pale pine as the finest of his coffins. The wood was sanded to a silken smoothness, the rockers perfectly balanced. It was simple, sturdy, and beautiful. A proper place for him to sleep, Caleb said, his voice a little rough with unshed emotion. He placed it beside the bed. Together, they gently transferred the sleeping infant from Amelia's arms to the cradle. The baby sighed, his tiny fists uncurling, and settled into his new bed. "He needs a name," Amelia said softly, her eyes not on her son, but on Caleb. He looked from the baby's face to hers, and in that moment, a silent, perfect understanding passed between them. "Matthew," he said, the name coming to him as if it had always been waiting. It meant gift from God. "Matthew," she agreed, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. Caleb reached out and gently brushed it away with his thumb. "Thorne," he added, his voice quiet but firm. "Matthew Thorne, if that's all right with you?" "Yes," she whispered. It was more than an agreement. It was an acceptance, a vow. It was the moment they became a family, truly and irrevocably. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved object. It was a wooden button, no bigger than her thumbnail, with a tiny, detailed flower etched into its surface. "For his first coat," he said, a token, a promise of a future, of warmth, of a life he intended to provide for and protect. She took the button, its delicate, sturdy weight, a tangible symbol of the new life they had built together, in this quiet room above the workshop of endings. Their life settled into a new shared rhythm. The house was no longer a place of silent solitude, but of quiet, joyful purpose. Caleb's days were still defined by the scent of wood and the rasp of his plane, but now they were punctuated by the sound of Matthew's cry, or Amelia's soft humming from the rooms above. The workshop, once a place solely of endings, now felt like the foundation of a new beginning. He found his focus had shifted. For years, he had scanned rooms for exits, for threats, a habit from the war he'd never shaken. Now he found himself scanning for moments of grace, the way the morning light fell across the cradle. The sight of Amelia, asleep in the chair by the window, her book fallen into her lap, the impossibly small hand of his son wrapped around his finger. His ingrained instinct to protect had softened, evolving into a deep, abiding need to cherish. He would find excuses to go upstairs during the day, bringing Amelia a cup of tea or a freshly baked piece of bread from the town baker. He would stand by the cradle, his large, rough fingers stroking the baby's soft cheek, a sense of wonder filling him each time. He was a man who had thought his heart was long since buried, but this small child and this courageous woman had resurrected it. Amelia, in turn, found a peace she had never imagined possible. The constant fear that had been her shadow for so long had finally receded, replaced by a deep sense of security. She watched Caleb with their son, and her love for him deepened with every gentle gesture. He was a natural father, his stoic quietness a perfect, calming counterpoint to the chaos of a newborn. His service, his protection, was no longer just for her. It was for their family. One afternoon, he came upstairs and wordlessly handed her a single perfect wildflower he had found growing by the creek bed. It was a common, simple bloom, but he presented it to her with the solemnity of a king offering a crown. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and tucked it into the small vase on the windowsill. It was a clumsy gesture for a man unused to such things, but it was a declaration louder than any poem. It said, "I see you. I think of you. You are beautiful." In these small, repeated gestures, their love story was written. It was a language of poured tea and mended shirts, of wildflowers and carved wood, of a quiet, steadfast devotion that needed no grand pronouncements. It was simply a truth they lived every day. As the weeks turned into months, Matthew grew, and the love between Caleb and Amelia deepened, settling into the comfortable, easy intimacy of a shared life. The cradle Caleb had built was now often empty, as Matthew had begun to explore the small world of their home on his hands and knees. The rooms that had once felt so stark and empty were now filled with the warmth and clutter of a family. One evening, the autumn air had turned sharp and cool, and a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow over the room. Matthew was finally asleep in his cradle, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Amelia was darning a small hole in one of Caleb's socks, her head bent in concentration under the lamplight. Caleb was at the table, sharpening the blade of his favorite chisel, the soft, rhythmic scrape of stone on steel, a familiar, comforting sound. He looked up from his work, his gaze falling on her. The firelight caught the soft curve of her cheek, the gentle line of her throat. A wave of profound contentment washed over him. This was his life now, this quiet, domestic peace, this woman, this child, this home. He set down his tool and went to her, kneeling before her chair. He took the sock and the needle from her hands, setting them aside. He simply took her hands in his, turning them over, studying the palms. They were no longer the hands of a desperate fugitive, but the hands of a mother, a partner. There were small calluses forming from her work in the small garden she had planted, a pinprick on her finger from her sewing. He lifted her hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss into each palm. It was a gesture of reverence, of gratitude. "You are safe here," he had promised her on that first day, a vow made by a stranger to a stranger. It had been a promise of physical protection. Now, looking at her in the warm firelight, The promise had a new, deeper meaning. It was a promise of the heart. She looked down at him, her eyes shining with a love so deep it needed no words. She reached out, her hand coming up to cup his jaw, her thumb stroking the rough stubble. Her touch was an answer, a vow of her own. "We are home," she whispered. It was the simplest of truths, the most profound of promises. It was the final, quiet, perfect conclusion to a story that had begun in the dust of the street, and had found its beginning, its middle, and its heart in the steady, quiet shelter of his love.